right, let me try that once more. Welcome. We're going to go through our second panel and in the area theme of layers. When it comes to data lake and data lake house, is that one way to think of how we're layering out these technologies in the cloud? What have you been experiencing around those different layers? And then we can dive into a discussion on that. So I'll start with Juan.
Yeah. Well, just simplistically, for me, a data lake is really just about trying to capture your raw data as is and make it available for downstream processes. So capturing your data and being able to make it readily available for the subsequent layers which we'll talk about. So for me, that's one of the principal aspects of this strategy is kind of having your data available and be able to pull it when you need it. So
Go ahead.
I would say generally the goal of any architecture is to figure out how do you get from your starting state to your end state. And so many architectures have different layers. So what uniquely does the data lake add? I think it's just another tool that maybe allows you to have additional layers that can serve additional purposes. So like Juan said, one layer that often the data lake adds is this raw layer where you can ingest data from all these systems that might be software as a service on third party through a REST API. It might be physical databases, but you can get all that data co-located in its native format. And then there might be additional layers. Generally, I encourage people to think through define your layers up front and almost like roles and expectations, say, what's the objective of that layer? What are some of the characteristics? Is this data lake storage? What does the folder structure look like? What are the file formats? Is it conformed or not? Is it cleansed or not? Kind of what is the purpose of each layer? Because you can over-engineer it, you can start with less. So the answer can vary depending on which client it is, but certainly when we're talking data lake, one of the main layers that it starts with is raw that we all agree to, and probably we can go into more detail. Some people might call them bronze, silver, gold, but there's additional layers of curation. So I suspect that's what we'll get a lot more into of some of the specifics of that.
Sure, when we're talking about zones, but the difference between layers and zones when it comes to data lake versus using a semantic layer or a logical data warehouse, that kind of thing is it's in theme now. And the zones, I think, is kind of the different how we're differentiating that layers from zones, right?
Yeah, there can be a lot of so within the data lake, a lot of people might put 3 layers of bronze, silver, gold, or something like that in at a real high level. One is just raw. So if you're importing JSON files, you leave them as JSON, CSV. If you're getting zip files from a third party, you land it as is so that it's a record is there and archived and available. You can always reprocess that down the road, but it's an archive effectively. And it's cheap storage and you don't have to worry about the format because they're just files. Then there's if you may have a silver layer, which is kind of some level of curation. So at that point, you might say, I want to standardize the data types. So I want to go from, it could be anything to maybe some sort of relational or maybe not relational database, but it's a structured data set in that you're saying these are the data types. I want to make sure that this field is actually a date, or I want to make sure that it has these 10 fields. So you're somewhat trying to conform it to a schema, business entities, et cetera. And then there's further curation where we start talking specific models that can lend themselves to data science or analytics. So that can be a Kimball dimensional model or something else.
Okay.
And that center layer could be whatever data model you want, but it could be something like a data vault layer where you define your business entities and the relationships between them.
Okay. That makes sense.
Real high level, those are kind of the 3 main layers within the data lake, and then semantic and other stuff might lie outside of the data lake.
Okay, good. Thanks, Scott. Have any comments around layering data lake versus data lake house versus logic warehouses? What are your experiences around these layers?
Yeah, I do, Paul, so I can jump in here.
Okay.
So when we think about data, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. So when we think about the difference between data lakes and lake houses and the different layers, really the big difference is and I know this gets a little fuzzy within Azure, but it's really, do we want a EDW in a traditional sense, or no data warehouse or enterprise data warehouse, right? So we have, Scott mentioned, we have the data lake, we have the different zones, we're bringing the data in, and then you got to do something with that data to visualize it. And really the big difference is if we're in a data lake, which is the more traditional modern approach, you take that data, curate it, and then you push it into something like Synapse or Snowflake or whatever you want for your MPP power data warehouse. As for the lake house, you're keeping that data in the data lake, and then you're putting these compute powers on the lake, which to me is, I think, the direction that we're going to be emerging to, just because it makes sense of bringing your data into the data lake, allowing it to rest there in your curated fashion. But then we can put these things like Spark pools or Synapse pools or some type of machine learning or AI process on top of it, and we're really reducing the data movement at that point, right? We get it into the gold refined state, and then we leave it there, and then we do things with it there. So to me, that's the biggest difference between a lake and a lake house.
I like that. So it's about some of these architectures thinking in terms of maybe a layer that's storage and putting compute on top, so you're not moving data around as much, less movement layer versus your transforms layer that might go on top of the storage.
Well, I mean, technically you still have your transform layer on top of the storage. So we can use something like Azure Data Factory or Databricks or some type of Azure Functions or code, but you're moving it, not that far. You're just placing it in different folders within the lake, so it's logically structured in those different zones, so that we understand what that data is within those zones, whether it's raw all the way to, hey, we're applying some business or processes, and then finally we have this gold standard of truth that everybody can start to consume downstream.
Yeah. And that's makes sense when we think about the zones piece. Part of where we had some questions to try and understand the layering was on the differences of the lake house, or a logical warehouse to break things down. Do you have any experiences around logical warehouse? What that might be?
I do. Traditionally for our clients, since we're Microsoft, right, that's Synapse is our data warehouse. But it really comes down to what you're doing with that data and who's accessing that data, and how quickly they need to access it will determine whether or not you need that data warehouse or not, right? As we start to see this shift that's happening within the world, where everybody's getting impatient and they want stuff real time, and that's kind of why the data lake house is emerging, is so that we don't have to have that extra stop of going to a warehouse. We just bring our data through the data lake, we cleanse it as quickly as possible, and then we fire it out to whoever needs to consume it. So that could be a Power BI report, that could be some application downstream, it could be an alert to the phone. I mean, it could be anything that you want it to. That's really the difference, is who's accessing it and how quickly do they need to access it. Will help. That's the questions I asked with my clients to determine the architecture that they need.
Yeah, nice.
So a lot of people talking about logical data warehouses. So does that really go together, the logical data warehouse on top of a lake house, of more of the putting some kind of logic over more not a traditional EDW, and not moving data, but logically putting it in a usable form? Make sense?
A little bit.
Not sure what your question was.
So
So I don't know exactly if there's an official, what is a logical data warehouse, but I think some people might say, is a lake house a data warehouse or not, or are they two distinct things? Mm-hmm. So to me, data warehouse conceptually means I want a place where I can store my business data collectively. And I think a data lake also accomplishes that. We're taking data from all the systems, we're storing it. Some people might differentiate a data lake from a data warehouse in that the data lake might just be semi-curated as far as what your business entities are. So you're taking data from what are source systems and turning them into business entities as far as how you organize it. But then are you putting a layer on top that enables more analytical end user analysis? So some people might differentiate that as a data warehouse and the interim business entities not as a data warehouse.
Okay.
But I think you could loosely think of it, they're all accomplishing that goal of bringing your data together across all your systems, across all of your history to make it available for those purposes. So I think in loose terms, I'm personally okay calling both of those a warehouse. To me, the data lake house just means that the primary persistence of the data is all within the data lake. So we're not putting a separate layer in a separate system for to hold that model. So if we don't need high-speed queries, then a lot of times that can be okay. So that's where I think Josh's point with the consumer. So a data lake just being files, although we can be massively parallel, it's still not a highly specialized system like a massively parallel data warehouse. So sometimes there's a need to kind of cache info marks.
What's interesting about this though is the technology kind of blends, right? So you can, like, we use BigQuery and we treat it as you guys describe it in the lake house, right? We land all our raw data in there and we manipulate it inside of the warehouse for all the layers. So it can be, even though it's an enterprise data warehouse product, we use it in that lake house architecture.
Okay.
It's probably worth clarifying when we say how fast, right? Because it used to be data warehouse meant nightly process. And for a lot of people, it still might. The data lake house now, so querying data that is stored in some file formats in the data lake, in a blob storage, it's gotten pretty good. And some of the formats are essentially their own columnar data store. So they're pretty fast. But when we say pretty fast, it might query in a second or two for a really large data set, which is actually great, right? If you could query millions of records in a second or two. But that's where it depends on what your consumer is. If they want to report right now, maybe that 2 seconds doesn't meet your service level agreement.
Okay.
So that to me is where you start to say, now I need a caching layer so that analysis or reporting is maybe a little more instantaneous.
Nice. Good point. Joel, are we coming through? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Paul, I had to turn my camera on real quick.
Here.
I mean, I think what everybody has said is really good and on point. To me, one of the most fundamental basic differences between a data lake and a data warehouse is that a data warehouse has always been very structured. It's all structured oriented data related for business use, where the data lake, when it was at its onset, was really meant for unstructured or semi-structured data. And the data lake house concept emerged once they were able to really bring in it all into one spot, right? And start moving transformations and creating a warehouse from there. And I think I've heard it a couple of times. I totally agree with the whole idea of what is the actual end use? Is it for an analytics report? Is it to feed an application? Is it to actually move, the data warehouse used to be central to a data architecture. In the modern world, it's more downstream itself. And so is it just going to be basically fueling a data warehouse further downstream? The question about the logical aspect of it, I think Nicole is asking, where does it sit? When we've been doing data virtualization projects with typically Denodo and their concept of a logical data warehouse was taking advantage of the metadata that's produced, right? And I think a growing trend is actually the use of metadata in general to automate and accelerate things. And so that's where it became this sort of panacea of, you could put this virtualized layer between over what would be your data warehouse, what would be your transactional databases, what would be your data lake, and then create a semantic layer at the end of the day to actually provide more real-time insight for a lot of these applications. So I think what everybody kind of said was pretty much spot on, just in a different way.
Sure.
Thanks, Joel. That was getting at my question that I didn't ask very well.
So,
Paul,
yep.
I think it's really interesting to call out and point out the comment Scott made around how fast do you need it and the speed of data now. 2 seconds might not be fast enough, which for those of us in the room who have been around for a couple of years, that's insane when you think about just how fast large data can be brought back now, and the expectations of the business being, hey, it's got to be sub 1 second or it's not acceptable at large chunks of data. You know, I think that's something when we talk about modern architecture and the cloud, that's an awful lot of horsepower if you want to have that on-prem and do that kind of thing with that type of data versus put it up in the cloud and all of a sudden, yeah, I can run millions and millions of rows through and have the data back in sub 1 second response time. That's such a just fundamental shift in historically what has happened in IT and analyzing data.
Sure. All right, so layers is a little fuzzier. We branched into zones a bit. So that whole idea of the bronze raw data, silver for things getting cleaner and better, gold for general business strategic use, perhaps. But I'm curious what the panel thinks about what belongs in the bronze layer. Juan?
Yes, we don't call it bronze, silver, gold. So I'll use our terms. Our term for bronze and raw is when we do call them in raw. So that's basically what I mentioned. We land in our warehouse, our raw data, more or less as is. So if it's a CSV file, we change it to a table, or if it's a JSON, we just load it in as an unstructured JSON. And that's kind of what we call our raw. It's just there and it's available. And the first step of our transformation is the standardization step of changing types, naming conventions, that type of thing. And we call that our stage layer. It's kind of the end of the raw transformation. Then we have an intermediate layer where we put all of our intermediate calculations. So anytime metrics we're calculating or any union of data we need to do, it's all kind of temporary data. And finally, we have a public layer that all of our public models get published to. One thing that we're trying out here that kind of ties to the data mesh is within each of those layers, we have intermediate data that might be useful for other intermediate processes. So we have ways of publishing, hey, this is a data set that you can hook into for not public consumption, but for our data team to hook into it and further transform and work with. So we have that kind of concept as well, which is kind of interesting.
Would that be gold in terminologies for other cases, or is it still, there still might be some curation happening, so maybe it's not done yet?
I would still call it silver, right? It's not meant for a business person to hit. There's some nuance to the data. It's more of a, hey, this is an interesting piece of data. It's available to the rest of the data team, and have at it. It's supported from that sense.
Sure. Go ahead.
I really like that because I've seen organizations that have some data integration needs and they're waiting until the gold layer,
Yeah.
the consumer layer, whereas it could have been available at that silver layer.
And it's broad, right? Once you get to,
Yeah.
data sets are massive at the raw layer. They kind of start shrinking and shrinking.
Mhm.
And so the more you can expose out to the data professionals or citizen analysts or whatever to look into pieces of data and build up more of their own things, that's kind of a strategy we're trying to follow.
Are your data scientists coming in at that layer?
They're about to. They're getting in right next few weeks here.
Okay. And not in the gold layer?
They'll be in both.
Both.
Let's go in silver.
Mhm.
So on those bronze, silver, gold, curated, raw, Scott?
I don't actually like the terms bronze, silver, and gold either. I just see them very widely used. So I was kind of, if you've heard that, to me, it's all about the purpose. So I like to sit down. I like to kind of outline, here's the layers we're going to have and here's why we're going to have them. So raw means I want the ability to capture unstructured stuff the way it is. So sometimes you might have an ERP system, you have 5 instances of it, 5 versions floating around a large organization. So raw, at that point, I don't try conforming at all because they might be slightly different. You land it as is. So that's raw. But then my next goal is that's from a system like underlying technology perspective. At some point, I want to model the business. So to me, the next step, or it might be the next 2 steps, is how do I find out what the key business entities are, their relationships, and now how do I transform the data from systems into business? So that way, if I switch from one system to another, I just start ingesting that into the same model, because unless my business changed, I'm still talking customers and products and whatever else. So to me, silver is now, we're talking in terms of business, and you might be able to give that to a data science person. They don't have to worry that you have 5 implementations of an ERP system. They just now think in terms of sales and products and customers. And so they might be able to work at that level. And then I think about end consumers. So what are my reporting and analytics needs where maybe they're not comfortable dealing with that still, I don't know.
Just say it, it's executives.
No, I think, I wish it was that, but the reality is most people, so to me, if you have business entities and relationships between, if you're comfortable writing SQL queries, you can work in that layer. But a lot of people aren't comfortable working with SQL queries, right? Like we've tried just giving the business SQL queries before we had all these other technologies, and it didn't always go over well. It's changing. There are a lot of strong technical people in the business area, so that isn't true for everyone. But in general, I think Kimball dimensional models, InfoMarts, creating these smaller sets of data where people can freely slice and dice and not have to think about cardinality and that's not related to that and get themselves in trouble. I think that's good. You want safe zones. So I think that to me is the gold layer. We're saying I can give this to the business and they can do whatever they want and they can get insight. They have no idea of the complexity of those relationships in that middle layer.
Nice. Jarrell, thoughts on the layers like this?
Yeah,
Makes
so,
sense to you, or?
It makes a lot of sense. And so when we do our projects around Snowflake, we definitely have kind of that bronze, silver, and gold expectation. And for us, bronze just means it's being ingested, right? Silver layer is that it's more organized and cleansed. And almost, I think to Scott's point, that is basically where we can then create a workload for a data science kind of sandbox. Because it's sort of blessed. People know what's going to be in there, and that it's met some data quality. It's met some data quality expectations that the data scientist or advanced data analyst can take advantage of that. Then when we do get to that gold level, it's much more curated. It is more modeled. It is having sort of that dictionary of what the business is going to be understanding as business glossary applied to it a little bit more. What I do find interesting is then when we look at the front end tools of today, I'll use ThoughtSpot, right? ThoughtSpot's a fantastic tool where you can simply say, I want to look up sales for this product in this region in 2012. And then you'll get a result and then say, okay, I want to see 2015 now. You didn't have that several years ago. So you could almost direct that right over that silver layer. And even the more general business analysts can now kind of dive in even further without it needing to be at such a curated Kimball modeled sort of format.
Nice. Joshua, do you have any thoughts on these layers?
I do, yeah. So when I typically work with clients and put together architectures around these different layers, and for the most part, it's the same across the board as most everybody has said here, especially Scott. But the one approach that I do take with them is, so when raw comes in, that's in the raw format, whether CSV, PDF, whatever it may be. And then I take it into bronze, and bronze is where I put it into a format like Parquet, so that we have a standard format that we can operate from for the rest of the different layers. And then within the silver layer, that's really where I bring all of the data together, and I talk to businesses to understand how they speak about their data. For example, what is a customer, right? And what is the main source of customer, and what different systems have attributes that may enhance the idea of customer. So that's where that gets applied within the silver. And then we do apply some soft business rules around data types, formatting, things of that nature. And then when we go into the gold, that's where we apply the enterprise or the hard business rules for the different systems that are consuming it downstream. So the approach is more of when we get into that silver layer is really around like understanding the business and domain driven design and aligning those models or entities within the lake around that concept.
Nice. So this silver layer is where a lot of clarification starts to happen. And there could be different ways that that chaos is brought to heel. I've heard Jarrell talk about ThoughtSpot being put right on top of Silver because it'll use natural language processing to try and figure stuff out. Joshua brought up speaking with the business really happens at the Silver layer to really understand. So what strategies have you found most effective for organizing that chaos in the Silver layer before it gets to the gold? Duan.
So one thing that we have been trying to do is rather than having these layers by themselves, we actually organize our layers around domains. So we are in the transportation business, so we might have a domain around carriers, which we have these these zones within that domain, right? So within the data we're ingesting for around carriers, which is very interesting data, by the way. We're going to have these layers within it. So that's how we can organize that chaos. It's by saying, here's a domain, and then we segregate out the layers rather than just having the domain in all the zones and having all domains spread across it. We just inverted all of them.
Okay. Scott?
Yeah, I think, again, it's really what are the entities and the relationships and what do you need to kind of manage that. And but one thing I'd add on, that concept of ThoughtSpot or Power BI or some other tool going on top is what can keep data warehousing or BI developers in business is if there are really complex reporting requirements. And so, for example, point in time reporting data. So let's say that you have a sales representative, they're the representative for this region, they make a sale. Now, a year from now, there's a different manager of that region. So now when I report on sales, do I want to show the person who managed that region at that point in time a year ago, or do I want the current one? And so there are strategies and frameworks for capturing those types of changes. And Data Vault and even dimensional modeling with slowly changed dimensions allow you to do that. So to me, if you're implementing kind of a full-blown enterprise data warehouse, you're generally implementing some of those strategies, which enables some really great, powerful, complex reporting. The downside, though, is that's where it somewhat prevents you from taking a tool like Power BI and ThoughtSpot and just analyzing it, unless you know to only look at the current value, or because there might be multiple versions of records. So generally, to me, data science can still use that layer because we can kind of coach them on here's how you get through some of those rules to work with the data properly. But for a general end user, you want to mask some of that complexity and just kind of show them current version, for example, in most cases, just to simplify things. And then a tool like Power BI works really well. So that's just kind of one caveat. It's not necessarily how you structure the silver layer, but it's if you enable some of that more advanced analytics through some of that complexity, it has the side effect of also not making it as consumable by your end users.
All right. How do we drill? How do you have strategies around organizing the chaos in the silver layer beyond ThoughtSpot?
Yeah, so it's still kind of a modeling exercise. I mean, we apply something that's loosely related to Kimball and creating the business dimensional model that was kind of put into place by Laura Reeves several years ago. But what we like about using that model is that the process of it is definitely bringing the business and IT into the room, or the data team into the room at the same time. And you're building out a data dictionary, you're building out a business glossary, all kind of simultaneously. And then you're still kind of you're looking at the redundancies you might have in the data points, and to a lot of the points that Scott was mentioning, it can get streamlined that way. So that's how we execute that a little bit more in our silver layer, if we look at it that way, silver zone.
Joshua? Still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. So for us, it really comes down to when I have a conversation with the clients around really where they're at within their journey, right? So for example, if they're all on-prem today, just the idea of bringing data to the cloud could be very new and foreign to them, right? Because we do a lot of things within the cloud now that we just weren't capable of doing at a cost perspective on-prem. So that's the one extreme. And then on the other extreme, where businesses today understand this transformation, they're putting a lot of money or effort behind it, and they're reorganizing their whole IT around either value streams or these domains or these contexts within the organization. And that those ranges help determine how am I going to align the client with the silver layer. How far are we going to go into this domain driven design? Or are we going to try to keep it close to what they have today on prem and make it more of a phased approach? So that's really what I do with clients, is just try to figure out where they're at, where they're going, and then that helps determine where our boundaries are and how extreme or how fast we go within the silver layer towards that domain driven design.
Nice. So on the gold, the most curated, the most end consumer zone, lots of types of people and workloads are being asked from that zone. What experiences do you have around controlling or limiting access or handling the fact that everybody might want that super fast? It all needs to be real time. Or what strategies help manage the fact that everyone wants to work with that layer at different ways of their analysis? One.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer this question exactly right, but for our use case, we typically are using our warehouses to store all of our data, and people can have access, but you are going to get seconds of latency to get your results back. That's just the nature of these types of databases. But we also hook up our application that we sell to our clients to this thing. We do need a very fast interface, and then we have a specialized layer that puts things into a very compressed arrow format that we can query and get very sub-second response times for most performant queries for our clients. So that's kind of our strategies for our analytics internally. They're going to wait a few seconds, that's fine. But for our highly used applications that we don't want to spin up a huge bill on GCP, therefore we have a separate access layer that we query.
Scott, is it all about the speed really of creating that gold layer so it can be real time, or is there other strategies here?
The security is a book in itself.
That's a big topic.
Yeah. So, but the reality is, when you take all your consumers, you want to try to keep that as simple and generalized as possible. So if you can say, I have this department in Power BI and they all share the same access, great. You can expose a model to them and say everybody there gets it. Tools, depending on the tool you're using, whether it's Power BI or something else, a lot of times they'll have role level security, so you can define rules within that cached model or that imported model. So you might have a number of infomarts or models or data sets, whatever you want to call them, that are sourced from your warehouse or data lake that can then be cached and have their own rules and defined. But
so I'm curious, that security layer, do you typically do the tool layer, or do you?
Yeah, so for like for Power BI, if I were doing that, yes, it has role level security which works really well. So I could define a rule such as each manager can see their own region, and so dynamic rules like that make life really easy and flexible, because you can just then give the entire department access, and the rules manage kind of the one-offs. But when you start talking the data lake house, I think that then becomes one of the challenges, that depending on how you expose it there, if you're giving people access, now you have to think about where you're storing the files physically. So now it's kind of an additional layering of how you structure things. So not just logically how you structure it, but now making sure you can apply the access controls to those different files. And that can get really complicated. So the best thing you can do is simplify your rules. That makes it easier to implement. If it is more complicated, I guess one of the side benefits of the data lake is, the storage is relatively cheap. So it might be you're duplicating data in various spots to simplify being able to secure it in, for the right audience.
So my angle on that question was mixed workloads going after the same set of data. And I'd like to hear from Juan a little bit more on what you described briefly An example would be, you have your data scientists, you have, maybe you have an external portal for your clients interfacing like you talked about. Maybe there's some data integration that's going on with a partner, and how you're architecting that same or similar data for mixed use cases.
Back to one.
Magic really just understanding the use cases and finding the right solution. So again, for us, our data scientists, they can deal with a few seconds of waiting for the terabytes of data to come through. That's fine. They can wait. Our clients can't do that, and nor do we want to let them expose that much. So we just built something that for that use case that, one of the nice things about these technologies, especially the modern data warehouses, is just the compute power that's in them. So it's such a great tool to do all your metrics computations, run your machine learning models even inside of them, and then produce data assets that can be published out. And so that's our strategy: just publish the data out, cache it, then allow flexible access to that data for that type of use case. We don't have any other use cases other than that. What we're doing.
I'd almost say the gold layer that we're talking about, some people might think of that as the layer before the consumer stuff.
Exactly, it is.
And so then the real question is, well, what's the layer after gold? And I'm like, that's consumer specific. It's what's the specific that in it, security, all of that is custom catered to that consumption.
Paul, can I add to that?
Yep.
To the question, because I have an experience with Snowflake. I haven't worked with the other data warehouses, but with Snowflake, that is one of the features that you can have one copy of the data kind of shared across multiple workloads. So you could have data scientists coming into the same copy, the BI reports could come in, you could do ad hoc reports out there, and it works really well. We have tested it out. So that concurrency issue, which we used to have so much in our SQL Server environments, you don't see that in Snowflake.
Yeah,
So,
I used to work on an on-prem MPP large cluster, and it had a workload manager on top of it where you could assign workload priority and so forth. And then we also separated nodes, kind of like you're doing with the Snowflake instances for different workloads.
yeah, they call it, the third they use is warehouse, right, for compute. So you would have different warehouse for different workloads.
Yeah.
And then those warehouses can have the same copy of the data.
Virtual warehouse is a terrible name that Snowflake uses,
The warehouse is a terrible name.
but it does identify the different type of workloads, and Rakesh has totally stole my thunder, but I respect Rakesh. That's all good. But so like Nicole, to your point about sharing out that data, right? It's built into Snowflake. So you can make that data accessible to business partners, to customers. You can monetize it with their marketplace. That's one of the biggest selling points that Snowflake has these days. I think Scott mentioned that to meet certain needs of different users, you might have to duplicate data and things like that. That doesn't happen with Snowflake whatsoever. It's a single spot. It's one of the outstanding advantages that as a technology has in the marketplace today. And as Rakesh already noted, concurrency is one of the biggest challenges that Snowflake eliminates really quickly. So when you say, well, how can we scale up? What's that ramp going to look like? Is it going to be a slow ramp or an accelerated ramp? You're going to churn through credits. I'm not going to say you're not, right? But if you can make the right strategic plan around the usage and how many users and what the expectation is, you can create a great cloud cost management model for that. But you really don't hit the limitations of how many users can hit that model. With the caveat that was used before on what is your front end tool? Is it Power BI, and what sort of security you want to put on to certain degrees? So I almost think that question led to, it depends on your technology, like what is the actual platform you put into it to make it happen.
All right.
But I like your concept that y'all brought up on you're architecting it based on the use case.
Yeah. Josh, any thoughts on handling multiple types of workloads in that gold layer?
Gold or silver?
Gold or silver.
Yeah, so I think there was a part to the original question too around security as it comes to that gold layer. So with that, typically, and again, this depends on the client and where they're going and what they're trying to do. But I typically don't allow humans access to the data lake, right? So I try to secure that away from human interactions, and then we put it into some other technology for humans to actually consume, so that we can control security and integrate it with AVB or some other tool that they may have. So that's where Synapse comes in. For example, if we want to get into like a data warehouse, is that here business analysts go figure out analytics or create some Power BI dashboards from this data. You could do something like that. In addition to that, you have applications, and that's one thing a lot of people don't think about when it comes to these data lakes is the applications, right? It's just, hey, we put our data here, we're going to do something with it from an analytical standpoint, and that's pretty much it. But we want to feed that data back into applications. So that's where I like to incorporate something like Kafka, right? So that we can do real time if we need to, or we could slow it down if we need to as well. But in essence, what that's really doing is saying, hey, I got this model that's peer, right? So we have this definition of customer, and this is the gold stamp of it, and then we throw it out into like a Kafka queue or something else. It could be RabbitMQ or whatever, depending again on the client, and say, okay, now this is here, you can consume it when you need to. So we're not directly going against the lake, we're going against the tool that allows us to bring in data when we need to bring it in, and also version it as well.
Nice. Thanks. All right, so the next question in this vein, spinning off of how you say now humans are getting access to these layers and start to look at them. Organizations of humans that are looking at it could be a center of excellence team, could be a data excellence team, could be data scientist specific group, or some kind of cross-functional group that figures out this, or it's just general answers that leadership is asking for. What of those groups of humans have you found proves most effective in really interpreting working with the data? Would you recommend center of excellence teams or cross-functional business units, or what in that vein structures the humans the best to understand the data that we're looking at? One,
I think it depends what pieces we're looking at, right? So in terms of accessing the data, somebody else mentioned, we try to limit who has access to the raw or staging layers, because it really does require deep knowledge of the source systems and really more knowledge than a layman would have to know. But if you're talking about building up the various layers, as other people have mentioned multiple times, you really do need that cross-functional team to understand the data, model it correctly, put the appropriate quality checks in that you need, and make sure that it's trust the data once it's actually been built. For us, we are currently a very centralized data team, very small right now. We're looking to expand. So with the thought here for us, we have a centralized data that builds core assets, and then pockets of other people who can build those other domains up as needed. And then maybe in the distant future, maybe embedded analysts inside business units.
Mm-hmm. All right, nice. Scott?
Not sure if I'm interpreting the question right, but it's kind of like who should be building it or who should be consuming it.
Yeah.
I'll try to answer both. So as far as who should build it, I still believe that it should be someone who's a little bit more of a specialist from a BI data warehouse perspective. However, I'd like to see them working more closely with the business. And that's something that, maybe being too frank, I see happen far too infrequently. So often what might be modeled then is the source system. You're modeling the systems data that you're bringing in, not at getting to the heart of what the business purpose should be of what are your business entities, what are the relationships, what are the questions we want to ask of that data. And so I sometimes find that when it's great for us to talk about this technology, and as an architect, I want to keep all of this in my back pocket so I can apply the best solution. But it's not about the technology, it's about the business and helping your business improve and grow and improve your customers' lives. And if you're not doing that, none of this matters. And so you want a good, strong technical person to be building it. I don't necessarily believe it should be whatever tool works and kind of the shadow IT kind of concept, although some of those people might be highly But it still needs to be working really close with the business of why are we doing this?
Business involvement. Jarrell?
Yeah, so I think the best way that we've seen it, and it doesn't matter if it's a large organization or a small organization, when we look at that from a strategy perspective and getting to the organization of it, it's really a hub and spoke. The hub being kind of a data team, and then that can be a client's, team that they put together that acts as a center of excellence. They manage the infrastructure, they understand the analytics best practices, and the spokes are really, at the end of the day, an analyst that'd be a part of sales or marketing or procurement or supply chain, who really understand the business and understand what they need to see out of the data. And even in that model, for smaller organizations that use us as a managed service, I mean, that's how we do it as well. We apply the best practices of serving up quality data that meets the infrastructure standards that they need, so that the business can operate. A lot to what Scott was saying, that BI is called business intelligence for a reason. They need it to get the job done, and they're the ones that are going to be the true subject matter experts. So how data teams are being built out and organized, from data scientists to the actual data platform team to take care of things, is a maturing and growing area. Again, it just goes back to how big of a team our client really wants to have on the data side and the IT side, or if they want to be lean and nimble, right? Wear multiple hats. So the hub and spoke is kind of how we typically just see things happening.
Josh?
Yeah, so for me, I agree with both Scott and I apologize, I didn't catch the name of the person that just spoke. With the hub and Jarrell, sorry about that, with the hub and spoke model. But to take it a little bit further, I think what I like to do with organizations, and again, it depends on how mature they are, is really build the teams around these value streams or these data domains or contexts within the organization. So, for example, like if you have a product that you're trying to sell to an end consumer, and that's like one portion of your business, then let's put the team together that consists of these data folks, as well as application folks and QA folks and analysts and whatever needs the team needs to consist of, so that they can be successful. But at the end of the day, to your point about the hub, you still need a data governance team, in a sense, to say, hey, this is the way we're going to build our platform. This is how we're going to govern it. This is how we're going to apply security, so that when these teams around these value streams start to build out these things, they have the best practices put in place, so that they can operate in a similar fashion to every other team within the organization. So it takes a lot for business to get there, right? Like that's a highly mature, modern way of thinking. So not everybody's there. So then we have to adjust accordingly based on where the client is and where they're trying to go. And then ultimately for us, like how much money they have to spend is always a determining factor as well.
So Paul, I've got a question for anybody on the panel. So we're talking about these multiple layers before the consumers get to the data. We're talking about these multiple IT teams touching it before it gets to the end user. How are we solving, and how are you finding solving the issue of IT has always been the choke point for the business's data? And if you talk about hub and spoke, and you talk about these multiple layers before the end users ever get to use the data, how are we fixing that issue of the business is always, there's never enough IT resources to get the business everything they need? How are we getting better? How are we solving that if we're always putting these layers in between, these hubs and spokes, where it's always a matter of having to come back to IT to get your data?
I'm going to say Jarrell.
Well, you hire consulting groups to help you out.
I think I expected that answer.
It's a good answer, the right answer, but no.
To me, I think that's the differentiator between the silver and the gold, and again, using those terms very loosely, but ingestion now, you should be able to write something that's almost metadata driven, almost like Google crawling a site, right? You could just go to a database, look at the metadata, say there's 100 tables, land all the tables, and raw can do that without any additional configuration, right? So ingestion, you should be able to just knock out where all your systems are landed. The next one's a little bit harder where you're trying to get into a business model. So you have to agree on what your business keys are so that conforming and some things like that can happen. But again, you can do that fairly quickly. I think some of the challenges of historically, when I built say an enterprise data warehouse, we went straight to a Kimball dimensional model. And for some time, in some cases, that still makes sense. But that has the additional challenge of you need to agree on up front what's the granularity of your dimensions and your facts. And now you get a new system in and it kind of changes that. And so refactoring that was really kind of a pain. So to me, the data lake is this place where you can capture all of those different perspectives of those business entities from each of the different systems in a very clean, organized, kind of insert only, just keep bringing it in manner, and then take the time to start building these other InfoMarts or Kimball dimensional models or whatever on top of it. So I think it gives you another entry point. And again, for some end users, I don't think it solves that problem. I think some consumers are still going to need that more highly curated dimensional model or something along those lines. But for your data science and other teams or certain APIs, they can tap directly into that interim layer, and that's your time to value reduction.
It's one of the strategies we've been employing is to kind of level the playing field by exposing easy to use technologies from those kind of gold intermediate layer models. And so they don't have to deal with all the craziness of all the conformity that's happening upstream. They can deal with something that's not fully formed, but they can plug into it. And with SQL, produce new assets that they can use. So it kind of, I hate to use it, democratize a little bit more the technology and the resource pool that you have available to do it. It's been working for us.
That's what I was thinking too when you were asking the question, was on the idea that if IT appears like the bottleneck because IT is only working with those layers, do what you can with these platforms to make it not IT that's working with these layers. If it's upskilling on data analysis tools, if it's access and understanding that broadens the definition of what it means to be a cost analyst in finance, you're going to be dealing with more closer to raw data, and the tools are allowing you to. You've taken IT out of the bottleneck because these other departments have more enabled access and skills.
I didn't take it to that extreme, but I'm curious if anybody else.
I haven't got to that extreme either, just because of that's a big skill gap from. I was just talking more IT resource able to do than a dedicated data team in IT.
So this is still relying on IT to do the ingestion to get it essentially co-located and centralized in some curation into a silver layer, whatever that may be. So now we're talking business entities, some standardization, cleansing, whatever, just to make it a little more usable. Maybe 10 instances of a system gets into one table, so they don't have to deal with that complexity. So I still think, IT is a bottleneck from that perspective, but I think the rules for that, the ingestion and that basic curation, that should be much faster and easier to refactor than if you have to go all the way to one enterprise model that's dimensional.
Is it safe to say that trying to apply a lot of these technologies and partners that we work with are all going for a better kind of low code approach to everything to streamline that? And I think a lot of them are also adopting, again, a metadata driven approach to automate this and just put that set it and forget it sort of process in place. And I think that will help, where most of the upfront time working with the business is going to be just making sure you're doing things correctly and identifying the requirements, and then putting the levers in place with the technology will be a little bit more simplified. We will be more streamlined down the road.
Nice. Prakash, you had something?
Yeah, so I mean, if that's exactly what Dave and Scott were talking about, and that is leading to this whole concept of analytics engineers, right? I mean, that's where this they fill this gap out there. So you have data engineers who are kind of ingesting this data and building out there, and this analytics engineers team, they take this and then also bring in the data analysts out there. Just so that, and those data analysts could be in the business side. I mean, they don't have to be IT resources. One of the reasons why DBT is getting such popular is because of this. So DBT is a data build tool. Anybody with SQL skills can actually kind of do these not complex transformations, but simpler transformations. And then
You can do complex transformations.
I mean,
DBT, you can do complex trans. Do you want to?
But I mean, what I mean is a business resource, right? I mean, basic SQL skills, they don't need to build dimensional model data marts, right? But flat, flat white data sets, they can do it. We are doing that in our company. So I mean, kind of changes that bottleneck kind of concept.
Nice. Josh, any thoughts?
Yeah, so in my opinion, based on my readings, right, because data mesh is one of these architectures that's emerging. Not a lot of people are doing, but it's catching a lot of wind right now. And I think the data mesh, the goal is to solve this problem of having a bottleneck around IT. So with that, it's a lot of work in the sense that we got to think about data as products. Right? And in order to do that, we have to really restructure our business in general, right? So we take away the traditional walls of this is our sales team, and this is our marketing team, and this is our IT team, and we look at it from a value stream of my customer needs A, and we provide A to them. I have a different customer that has, maybe product line B, and we give them B or whatever it may be. And then we align those teams or those value streams with all the people that are necessary from all the different groups within the organization to make them successful. So whether it's analysts or salespeople or marketing people, whatever it may be, we put them on a team, and then that's how we structure our data. So this team owns this value stream, which owns this data as a product. So they're responsible for the ingest and the standardization and curating it and doing whatever analytics that they need to, and ultimately, stamping it or turning it into that product. And then that's where something like Kafka can come in and say, hey, we team A, who owns this value stream, certifies this data, and now you can go do whatever you need to enhance your data set with. So that to me is an attempt to try and solve that problem. But I think businesses and organizations, until they adopt that mindset, we're some time away from that. And I see that a lot with clients, where they'll do a part way. They'll be like, okay, we're going to organize our applications around product, but then their data team is still their data team. So the data becomes the bottleneck aspect of IT.
Well, it sounds to me like Juan is implementing a data mesh program now. With his example of carrier data and carrier data product.
We do organize our data around domains.
Yeah.
But I don't know. We can argue about whether it's a data mesh or not.
Why would you think that it's not based on the general definition? Because it sounds like it to me when you define that, I was like, he has a data mesh. Okay, that's pretty cool.
Definitely borrow some of those ideas about product and organizing that way. We definitely borrow those for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Now the question now becomes: so your carrier team, right? Are they consistent of all the people that are successful end to end of the moment of I got this thing that I got to ship or put on a truck to it gets transported, right? Is there a team that consists of marketing? And that's where I think that evolution comes from. Yeah, I mean, it's good to organize your data that way, and I think that's a step in the right direction. And I don't know your business, enough to sit there to say one way or the other, but I think IT could still be a bottleneck in that regard, right? Because you could have people from the business saying, I need more carrier data. I need this with the carrier data. I need that. But the IT folks are off doing some other, analytics project for a different domain.
All right, I'm gonna say data mesh, we kind of moved into, and I wanted to get each panelist's opinion on the definitions of what a data mesh looks like. But we only want to spend a little bit of time on it because it's probably a pretty broad topic. We're just trying to get a, talking points about what do you think a data mesh is? This, right? If you can summarize. So Josh, you already kind of gave your definition of how it helps with that whole IT breakdown. So I'm going to actually turn it over to other panelists. What is data mesh, Sherelle?
Data mesh it's an approach to a domain specific ownership of a product that it has a front end and a back end to it. The front end is obviously owned by the business who wants to care about a particular area of their business and to that group that then relies on it. They rely on the IT to manage the infrastructure. They get, basically billed for it, but it's curated and set up to meet their demands. The question I would have as to who actually owns governance as that same data product gets, injected into other domains or scaled out upon. That's my terrible definition of data mesh.
Scott.
I haven't worked closely with it in practice, so this is really just kind of from an academic perspective, but my interpretation of it is really trying to decentralize the ownership, getting ownership closer to the business area that actually works and understands the data. Aspects of it that I also think are part of it that I maybe don't agree with, I think are cautionary, are, each of those areas then kind of can self-regulate to some extent and choosing tools and approaches that they're comfortable with to allow them to kind of fully own that. And I think that's where there really needs to still be this overall kind of governance to make sure there's some alignment, or how does that all work? So that's kind of my, in practice, I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, Juan?
So I really like this definition that's around the product orientation of the data. So organize your data around the products and the domains. That's something we do just because it became chaotic not to in our use case. One of the things though that why I hesitate to say that we are doing a data mesh is we are not distributing the work out to different business units. It is still centralized. It is centralized, and there's areas of expertise within our team, like our data science team is very deep into our a certain type of metric that they manage, and they kind of build that data product out.
So you think an essential component of the data mesh still involves decentralization? So
it's just a definition, right?
Okay.
Just a definition. In terms of the governance of the process, though, that's something that I do think a centralized team can help with, right? So being able to set up the code review process, change management process, the quality test, and being able to automate those checks and enforce that that's actually happening. A core team can set that up and then have other people have to conform to, even if it's the form of a peer review from an essential team member.
Excellent, thanks.
Nice. All right, we have about a few more minutes to finish up some talks about favorite enabling technologies. So within this space, we have Spark, Databricks. We have data visualization tools like Tibco, Denodo. We have data hubs, which are within SAP. And we have everyone's favorite ways of handling the storage. If you could pick in the last few minutes an enabling technology you think has been really neat and helped out in your projects the most, what would it be? One for each panelist. Scott.
Why? Yeah. I don't know. I'm still a big fan of kind of the end users because those are some who make decisions. So I'm still a big fan of like Power BI and Tableau and some of these other tool sets. But Databricks and Spark, the whole data lake concept, I still think that's kind of my second win. And Snowflake on the data sharing, I really love how they allow you to separate the compute so that each consumer you can independently manage their billing. And so I think that's great. So there's a lot of great stuff out there. I don't know that I have just kind of one.
All right. One.
So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say there's a few people who have expressed moving to the cloud embracing the cloud provider that you're with. So you get a lot of synergies when you're all in. You get a little bit of lock-in, but you get a lot of synergies when you're all in, especially on the data side. You're able to, for our use case, we're able to seamlessly integrate with all of our Postgres transactional databases that we have direct access to them from our data warehouse and those type of things. And GCS, the same kind of thing, the storage, file storage. So just embrace it all. Super.
Drink the Kool-Aid.
Cool.
Josh.
So I agree with one, right? It really comes down to if you're all in on a cloud provider, then I would say go all in on it, unless your strategy is to go multi-cloud. But at the end of the day, like technology changes so much. So I don't have a favorite. I'm always going to sit there and say I'm a Microsoft fanboy because I've worked for Microsoft in a sense from a consulting perspective for 15 years. So I mean, they've helped me get paid. But outside of that, it really comes down to, for me, what gets me excited is just helping businesses grow and achieve new heights. So technology helps us do that, but it really comes back to the process and where we're at and where we're trying to go. And then we base technology or products on those things.
Thanks, Josh. And Jarrell, are you just going to say Snowflake?
Yeah, I'm talking about Kool-Aid. I just came back from the Snowflake Summit last week, so it's pretty much a big brainwash, right? So it was a lot of fun, and they have a good direction going on how to help organizations who still want to keep a significant amount of data on premise while making their move, because it's a journey. So they unleashed some new products like Unistore. It is one of the only kind of data platforms that you can go across cloud and create a great strategy on, from that perspective. So it's just, and it's so simple to use that it's one of those things that when you want to help your clients create a great data team and a great program, it's just been kind of a no-brainer to get our customers up and running on it. So, yes, there's a lot of blue Kool-Aid, but I'm going to go that route.
All right. And Nicole has a question for the panel, invoking her trump card. What do you got?
Going back to data architecture, probably in the silver layer. If one of the panelists could describe Data Vault and when to use it, and in what type of client situations or use cases do you use it versus not?
Scott.
Yeah.
You made eye contact first.
Yeah. So I think, if the goal is to not model your systems and say, how can I capture the data from all my different systems, and as those systems change over time, how can I take my business model and put all the data into it that I need? And so Data Vault offers a solution for that is designed to allow you to accommodate a lot of the challenges that you would find. Now, it does make it a little more complex consuming out. So generally, you still then put a dimensional model on top. Again, you could give access to that layer. So what's great is you can ingest into that layer rather quickly. There's well-defined rules to allow you to do that rapidly. But you can give your data science folks access to that, but it's a little bit more technical to work with, because if you take all of your key business entities and then the relationships between them, and then their attributes, which in Data Vault terminology is called hub satellites and links, or links and satellites in order. It creates a lot of many-to-many relationships. But the beauty is, if you have 5 different systems that have customer, there's kind of one table that is your customer entity, and it automatically kind of conforms as long as you can agree on this is kind of the natural business key that defines a customer, or that social security number or name or whatever. And then if you have the 5 different systems that have customer attributes, those can each get captured in their own satellite. So anyway, it's a strategy for organizing the data. Some people have called it third normal form, like another way, which I actually don't agree with, but I think all of those concepts are trying to get to the point of you have business entities and relationships, and you try to model that.
Nice. Anyone else want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, so Inman would be closer to, I think, Data Vault than, say, the Kimball dimensional model. So there's lots of models out there. Data Vault is one that I agree, can handle a large degree of complexity in a well-defined way, which allows you to rapidly ingest data. I guess the flip was, when wouldn't I use it?
Yeah.
If the model isn't that complex. So if you don't have several instances of lots, if you have one system and it's a SQL database and you have reporting on it, don't over engineer. So a lot of what we're talking about, where the value of the data lake is being able to handle all the big data stuff. So variety of data, different formats, velocity, volume, like if you have all of those things, then these are really great tools to help you organize all that chaos. If you don't have chaos in the first place, don't over engineer it, like keep it simple. So if you can keep it simple, do it. These are good tools to help you turn really complex stuff into an organized way. If you don't have the complexity to start with, don't introduce it. I mean, that's kind of really overgeneralizing, but that's at a high level.
Anyone else want to take a stab at it?
I'm just gonna say that that was a great answer.
Yeah.
It's really complex at the end of the day. If you're not a large organization, I would not promote looking at it. We're helping two mid-sized organizations, move off of a data warehouse built on the data vault model because it's way too complex for their team at the end of the day. So it's just you got to really look at those options as to whether that's the right fit. Kind of goes back to David's question of how do you prevent IT becoming a bottleneck? I would say that the data vault can kind of lead you down that path pretty quick.
He's thinking, or you have someone?
I was just gonna make the comments to David's comment, just simplify it.
Yep.
Keep it simple.
Yep. Thanks.
Nicole, if you want real good knowledge about data vault, you should contact this person, Kent Graziano.
Graziano.
Yeah.
You want to type that into the chat for everybody, Jarrell?
Sure.
A strong advocate of data vault.
Yeah.
So I'll caution you from that perspective, but but you need to get that information too, right? When you make a decision. So.
You will find people that are really pro and against. And I can say it depends on how you're implementing it too. Like if you're trying to do it in SQL Server versus in a blob storage, and all those things matter. So yeah, just read it all with a grain of salt.
Nice. All right. Any other stump the chump questions? No? All right. Thanks everybody for coming. We're going to.
I don't have a stump the chump question, but
Yeah.
I haven't wanted to jump in from a vendor perspective and color the discussion, but I do want to share that next week there is a data and AI summit. You can actually join it virtually. It's free. And a lot of the concepts that have been discussed, from lake houses to data mesh, will be presented during that summit, as well as a lot of customer stories about what different organizations are doing. So I know folks are probably tired of virtual anything at this stage, but it is a free resource for you. And so maybe something that you want to check out.
Do we find that via Databricks Data and AI Summit?
It's just data plus AI summit.
Yeah.
And it is sponsored by Databricks, but it is not solely about Databricks.
I'll put the link in the chat.
Great. And I'll also mention that